The temperature plummeted.
Birds are falling dead out of the sky because it is that cold.
Freezing storms were everywhere. Snow fell in July. The Earth was gripped in an ice age.
It was just a disastrous situation.
But it wasn't the period when woolly mammoths roamed the Earth 15,000 years ago. It was a different era of cataclysmic cold, one that began just 700 years ago. A period known as the Little Ice Age.
Some of these men actually froze to death in early September. Most unusual occurrence.
From the 14th to the 19th century, the Little Ice Age hit man. Millions perished as the cold triggered a deadly chain reaction across civilization.
The suffering was totally harrowing.
Could it happen again?
Some of my colleagues think that we could go into an abrupt cooling state in a matter of decades.
What chaos would a new ice age trigger? What is the cold, hard truth of history's most recent big chill? In the summer of 1653, high in the French Alps, a monster crept towards the defenseless village of Natassé. The townspeople believed the forces of evil had unleashed it, and only God could save them. A contingent of priests armed only with holy water set off to confront the monster face to face. Finally, the priests came to a halt. Before them towered the object of the villagers' fears, a titanic river of ice. The glacier was one of many in the Alps that were swiftly advancing further than they had in thousands of years. The Alpine peasants were being surrounded by the encroaching ice, which was engulfing their villages and farmlands. No one that freezing day had any inkling that the glaciers threatening them were just one piece of a climatic puzzle that lasted from the 14th to the 19th century. An era now known as the Little Ice Age. Its effects were less dramatic than the last major ice age, which ended about 10,000 years ago, when 30% of the Earth was covered in ice. But its impact in many parts of the world was nevertheless devastating.
It's something that if we had experience with it in the modern world, it would really be a big disruption to our lives.
We know from historical accounts that it didn't take much to disrupt society.
The Little Ice Age reshaped the world in ways that now seem the stuff of fantasy. New York Harbor froze for 5 weeks, allowing people to walk from Manhattan to Staten Island. Eskimos sailed their kayaks as far south as Scotland. And 2 feet of snow fell on New England in June and July, during a season so cold it was remembered in both America and Europe as the year without a summer. The cooler climate played havoc and changed the course of history. From a freezing summer storm that decimated the Spanish Armada, to the famines that drove France's masses into Paris, demanding affordable bread, fueling the uprising that led to the French Revolution. The Little Ice Age descended with devastating suddenness around the year 1300 on a warm world whose climate was not unlike our own. It was a period when most people scraped out a hand-to-mouth living from the land controlled by the medieval nobility. An age that witnessed the rise of urban centres, the growth of trade, and the escalating strength of society's most powerful institution, the Church. For some 400 years, between 900 and 1300, this world had basked in a climate 4 to 7 degrees warmer than the colder and stagnant Dark Ages. Scientists and historians called the era the medieval warm period.
At that period of time, everybody was very dependent upon agriculture. If crops failed, people starved.
There were records of French lords complaining that British wine or English wine was undercutting their own product, and they made attempts to legislate against it.
Even in times of wonderful weather, even in times of prosperity, the medieval farmer, the medieval peasant, lived on the edge of doom. The average age is probably around 35 or 36. The level of infant mortality is appalling. Very few children, probably 1 in every 2, dies before the age of 1. So what we are talking about here is a very harsh world. Any change in the weather can be catastrophic.
On the eve of the Little Ice Age, they made the same assumption many make today. They expected the climate they had known for centuries to continue unchanged. They were soon to learn that they were no match for just a few degrees drop in temperature. At the dawn of the 14th century, an unseasonable chill began to descend on the warm world of the Middle Ages. With brutal swiftness, over the course of only a decade, the average global temperature dropped to a level some 4 degrees colder than today.
In places like Western Europe, it seems that what was happening was it wasn't just that the mean temperature was colder, but there were a lot of significant extremes. Many winters in which the temperatures were severely cold.
From Norway to New Zealand, glaciers began their rapid advance, growing more widespread than at any time in the previous 10,000 years. In England, the Thames froze frequently, inspiring a carnival-like tradition called the Frost Fair. Merchants and merrymakers flocked to the ice, setting up food stalls and sideshows. The first was celebrated in 1607, the last in 1814. The frost fairs were among the few pleasant byproducts of the sudden shift in climate. More typical was the disaster that descended on Europe in the 14th century, the first catastrophe linked to the Little Ice Age.
In 1315, from the Ural Mountains, deep in the heart of what is European Russia today, all the way to Ireland, the weather changed dramatically for the worse.
Just as the crops were planted, it started to rain, and it rained, and it rained, and it rained. And many of the crops planted on marginal land were simply washed away due to soil erosion.
The drenching rains persisted for 5 long years. The Little Ice Age was to be an era not only of cooler temperatures, but also of more frequent and intense storms. Throughout Europe, once fertile farmlands became waterlogged mud pits, littered with flattened crops. For the multitudes of peasants whose numbers had soared during the medieval warm period, there was little or nothing to eat.
By the end of the first year, there was hunger. By the end of the 6th, over 1.5 million people had died throughout Europe from starvation and from famine-related diseases.
Over the course of the Great Famine, crime soared. Grave robbers stole valuables buried with corpses and traded them for anything edible. The desperate assaulted anyone with food. When the crisis ended in the 1320s, the traumatized survivors returned to their harsh work in the drying fields. But they didn't understand that their choice of crops would continue to make them dangerously vulnerable. Peasants grew mostly cereal grains, wheat, barley, oats and rye, with which they made the breads and soups they relied on to live. But exposed to the elements on long stalks above the ground, they made easy targets for the Little Ice Age. Throughout Europe, crop failures persisted sporadically for centuries to come. Famine after famine produced a harvest of death. Between 1371 and 1791, 111 famines devastated France alone. In 1601, one famine in Russia was responsible for 500,000 deaths.
In a world in which there is so little food and in which most people are hungry all the time, and if you have a family, it is not uncommon in this period to kill your own children, or at least some of them, in order to reserve food for the rest. The story of Hansel and Gretel is indeed representative, and it's a story that goes back to the memories of the Middle Ages. Parents who don't have enough to eat and who take the children into the woods and abandon them there so as they could have enough food for themselves and for others.
People didn't often die of starvation. What they died of were famine-related diseases. And the episodes of malnutrition and other conditions which they acquired during the disaster of 1315 may well have debilitated them somewhat to the point that they were more vulnerable to outbreaks of bubonic plague which swept across Europe in medieval time.
During the Little Ice Age, what came to be called the Black Death found the ideal breeding environment.
The bubonic plague was made much worse during the Little Ice Age because people were already weakened by lack of food. Second, when it's cold and wet and damp outside, you don't go outside. So they huddled in small houses, and the rats came in too. That gave people the bubonic plague.
Europe's infected masses began dying by the millions. The stench of decaying bodies filled the air. Church bells tolled day and night. The mournful processions only spread the Black Death further. By the end of the epidemic in 1351, 25 million people had perished, a third of Europe's population. Those who survived continued to suffer through persistent famines and disease, many of which were triggered by the Little Ice Age. At flashpoints across Europe, the desperate reached breaking point, concluding the erratic climate was the evil handiwork of their neighbors, whom they accused of witchcraft.
The statistics are scary. In 1563, the city of Weissenberg burnt 63 women to death as witches. In the canton of Bern, over 1,000 people were killed as witches. You're talking considerable hysteria here.
The Church fed the frenzy. In 1484, Pope Innocent VIII issued a decree blaming Europe's cold, destructive climate on witches. Between the 14th and 17th centuries, foul weather and witch hunts went hand in hand. According to some historians, 50,000 men and women charged with brewing up diabolical storms were burnt at the stake. The Little Ice Age had ignited death and turmoil all across Europe. Another group of victims would be a remote colony of intrepid explorers at the edge of the known world. As the Little Ice Age mounted its assault on Europe in the 14th century, it also set its sights on an isolated colony at the edge of the Arctic frontier. The era's most vulnerable targets were a people who prided themselves on their strength and swagger. Since the 10th century, 4,000 Viking colonists had carved out a prosperous life for themselves on the rugged shores of Greenland. Although few in number, history would cast them in the Little Ice Age's most epic drama, in the fight for survival. The colonists were the vanguard of the most feared and dominant culture of their time. The marauding Vikings had terrorized half of Europe and sailed the vast expanse of the Atlantic to the shores of North America. Their outposts in Greenland were an experiment propelling Europe towards colonization of the New World, 500 years before Columbus. But the Little Ice Age would bring their experiment to a chilling end. The Vikings settled in Greenland during the height of the medieval warm period, around the year 1000. When the higher temperatures made it inviting and habitable.
It is sometimes thought that earliest Viking explorers to reach Greenland deliberately misnamed the country because they wanted to try to entice other settlers to come out. But in fact, when they first arrived there, they were struck by the lushness of the vegetation that they encountered in some of the fjords that they sailed into.
So the name Greenland actually may have been an accurate description because there may have actually been vegetation and greenery there at the time, and even trees.
When the Vikings came to this area, they must have been thrilled because they found large areas with grass that their animals could feed on. And they could even go high up in the mountains to grass because here you have good grass on a higher altitude. So this must really have been a paradise.
The Greenland Vikings depended not only on their abundant livestock to survive, but also on teeming schools of cod in the clement waters offshore. They also depended on imported goods from the distant shores of Europe. In return, they exported everything from polar bear skins to walrus tusks. The Vikings, who had begun to abandon their pagan ways and adopt Christianity, had faith that their future here was as limitless as the horizon. But with the arrival of the Little Ice Age, the mighty Vikings were forced to confront a faceless and formidable enemy, against which they had no defense.
The winters here were so cold, so severe, that the cattle and the sheep had to stay indoor in the stables for certainly more than 6 months and never come out all through the winter. And when winter was over, sometimes the cows were so weak from spending the winter that way that the farmers would have to go in and pick them up like little babies, pick them up and carry them out in their arms and put them on the fields of this spring and early summer to regain their strength.
As the Little Ice Age persisted, the Vikings' livestock perished in increasing numbers. Faced with starvation, the colonists turned to Greenland's marine life.
They know from measuring the isotopic composition of carbon in the bones from burials that originally the Vikings were nourished by 80% stuff from the land, so they ate a hell of a lot of land, and 20% from the sea. Then as time went on, gradually that ratio changed, and toward the end, they were down to 20% coming from the land and 80% from the sea.
The Vikings' plight worsened as the waters they now relied on for their only source of food became choked by ice. Greenland's schools of temperature-sensitive cod fled the freezing coast to warmer southern waters. The Vikings began to starve. The gauntlet of sea ice finally cut them off from their Christian brethren in Europe, whose supplies they relied upon to survive.
Long periods of time passed without any ship connection, sometimes generations.
One other determining factor was the Vikings themselves. Lessons in surviving the Little Ice Age had been within their grasp, but for more than a century they'd chosen to ignore them. From the beginning, they had shared Greenland with the native Inuit people, who over the centuries had adapted themselves ideally to the freezing environment. Unlike the Vikings, the Inuit were able to fish during the coldest months of winter. The secret of their success? Ivory harpoons, state-of-the-art compared to the Vikings' crude spears.
They were well aware of Inuit culture and well aware that the Inuit survived winters. They may not have done it very comfortably, but they survived it, and they were well aware of their fishing techniques, but apparently they didn't adopt them. Why? Because probably they thought the Inuit were inferior.
The Norse called the Inuit people skrællinger, and that's not a very kind word. In fact, it means ugly little people.
If they had chosen the way of encounter with this other race, and eventually mixing genes with them, mixing culture, then they would have been able to adapt to this country. But they refused, and that was a mistake that finally killed them off.
The Vikings' last stand in Greenland took place here, at the ruins of this church on the southern coast.
Valsø Church is important because this is the site of the last recorded historical event in all of North Greenland. The wedding took place here in 1408, and it must have been a large wedding because the source says it was attended by visitors even as far away as Iceland. What the source doesn't tell us is that it also took place in a society in disintegration due to the cold weather. But in fact, 50 years later, the Norse had all died out.
The Little Ice Age had humbled the fearsome breed, renowned for their toughness and invincible spirit. The Vikings had no idea what forces of nature were responsible for the freezing climate that defeated them. Sulfur deposits in the ice cores indicate that during the Little Ice Age there was an average of 5 major volcanic eruptions every century. Each of the eruptions had the explosive power of Krakatoa in 1883. Today, such powerful eruptions occur only rarely.
A volcanic eruption puts out particles and puts out gases into the atmosphere. The main gases they put out are water vapor and carbon dioxide, which mix with the atmosphere, but it's the sulfur gases that cause climate to change. If the eruption is strong enough, it will have a plume that goes all the way up into the stratosphere. And these react with water vapor to form a cloud of sulfuric acid droplets, a thin, hazy cloud that's in the stratosphere. It can stay there for several years. And this cloud reflects sunlight back to space and cools the Earth's surface. Less sunlight gets to the surface.
In the 1600s, Europeans had no way of knowing that the Little Ice Age would persist for 2 more centuries. Chilling new disasters awaited civilization. The The 1600s saw the Little Ice Age continue its unrelenting assault on the people of Europe. Decade after decade, the cold destroyed many of the vulnerable cereal crops they relied on to survive. The lethal cycle of famine persisted. Decade after decade, they lived on the brink of starvation. By 1789, they were a ticking time bomb in a society already fractured by political upheaval. That winter, frost and bitterly cold temperatures devastated the nation's cereal crops, nudging them closer to revolution.
The weather was colder than it had ever been. Two bad harvests and the cold had combined to put them into a situation where they knew they were not going to be able to make it through the next year. And they had to turn to the government, which at that time was having its own problems and was not able to do much for them. So it was a major factor in the French Revolution.
In July 1789, rioting peasants stormed the countryside and cities with pitchforks and muskets, terrorizing the aristocracy. The chaos magnified the political unrest already consuming the nation. After the Little Ice Age had played its role in France's historic upheaval, its impact was next felt with devastating force in Ireland. The year was 1845. 2 centuries had passed since the capricious climate had forced the Irish peasants to adopt the potato as a remedy to starvation. Ireland's potato-fed masses had tripled over the past 200 years. 6 million people now depended on the lumper as their only source of food. But when a mysterious blight suddenly attacked the Irish potato crop, a nation's lifeblood dissolved into an inedible mass of black goo. The Irish potato famine lasted for 5 years. Wood engravings drawn by the artists of the London Illustrated News chronicled the anguish. Starving children gnawed on weeds. Weakened by malnutrition, thousands died of cholera and typhus. Emaciated mothers cradled dead babies as they begged for money to purchase coffins.
The suffering was totally harrowing. There were stories of corpses in the street lying unburied and of rats devouring them in villages, and of people going round and finding families living in their homes lying in bed too weak to move because they were dying of hunger or of dysentery. It's estimated, and the estimate is probably conservative, that 1.5 million Irish peasants died during the Irish potato famine. The Great Death.
One dimension of history in which the Little Ice Age intervened most dramatically was war. Victory or defeat often depended on the freezing weather. In 2001, in Vilnius, the capital of Lithuania, a construction crew made a grisly discovery. Bulldozers unearthed 3,000 skeletons from what appeared to be a mass grave. Forensic experts determined that the bodies were almost 200 years old. Soldiers of Napoleon Bonaparte, victims of one of history's most catastrophic military campaigns, and the severe climate of the Little Ice Age. Throughout the period, weather played a crucial role in war. Generals learned that the elements could be their most formidable enemy or ally. Napoleon's lesson began in the autumn of 1812, after he had invaded Russia with a force of 600,000 men. Although he'd captured Moscow, he'd failed to destroy the Russian army and force the Tsar to capitulate. 3/4 of Napoleon's men had already died of starvation in the Russian wilderness, barren long before the Little Ice Age. As Napoleon ordered his 130,000 surviving soldiers to retreat for home, the climate took a nightmarish turn for the worse.
The weather just, it's almost like the bottom drops out. The temperature drops down into the 30s below zero. And according to a fellow named Caulaincourt, who was on Napoleon's staff, the snow or crystals would float in the air because he said the moisture in the air was freezing, but because it was so cold, the density of the air changed, and so they didn't drop out of the sky. They just hovered in the air as he was marching through them. And he said it was like a dream world. It was just something he had never seen before in his life.
Napoleon's starving, exhausted troops began dying by the thousands. Many yielded to a craving for sleep and froze to death. And many soldiers successfully fought off the bitter cold, only to die of starvation.
There's a memoir by one soldier that talks about how he survived during this campaign. He said it was so cold that the horses were, although they were moving, their outer skin was already frozen. And soldiers could go by and just cut off a piece of meat from a horse that was pulling a wagon from the flank. And because it was so cold, first of all, the horse was numb and wouldn't feel it. And then when he started to bleed, the blood would just freeze, so it capped off the wound, and the horse would just keep going along.
40,000 half-dead soldiers, a fraction of the original invading force of 600,000, made it as far west as Vilnius. In the city, which had little food, thousands died of starvation. Thousands more died from typhus and gangrene in makeshift hospitals. The stronger soldiers drove out the weaker from overcrowded houses and left them to freeze to death on doorsteps. Figures vary, but perhaps only 4,000 to 5,000 of the 40,000 who trudged into Vilnius escaped the city alive. 1815 also witnessed one of Earth's most spectacular natural disasters. In an era of increased volcanic activity that some scientists believe caused the Little Ice Age, the single most powerful eruption was soon to come. It would turn an already erratic climate upside down and cause what came to be known as the year without a summer. It began on the 5th of April with a deep rumble on the island of Sumbawa in Indonesia. On Sumbawa's north shore towered Mount Tambora, a 13,000-foot volcano thought to be extinct. On the 11th of April, Tambora exploded. The top 4,200 feet of the mountain was blasted skywards, spewing 36 cubic miles of debris into the atmosphere. This is the cataclysmic eruption of 9,000-foot Mount St. Helens in 1980. Tambora threw out 100 times as much ash.
We are talking about something that makes Mount St. Helens in 1980 look like a firecracker. Within instants of this explosion, 70,000 people on the island and on the neighboring islands died. And then that number went up to 90,000 very soon after that. A huge amount of ash went into the atmosphere. And think of it as not just kind of going up, but going way up above the level of weather, 15.5 miles into the atmosphere.
It's not the explosive power of a volcano that influences how much climate change there is. It's the amount of sulfur that it puts in the stratosphere, because the sulfur dioxide gas reacts with water vapor and forms tiny little sulfuric acid droplets that reflect sunlight back to space, cooling the Earth's surface.
Months passed before Tambora affected Earth's climate.
The first bizarre sign that something was really up with the atmosphere was in the snowfall that came in the winter of 1815 to 1816. Hungary, a snowy place, noticed their snow was brown. That's kind of strange. Apulia, in the south of Italy, which doesn't usually get snow, noticed their snow was red.
The multicolored snow was the peculiar result of Tambora's ash mixing with water vapor high in the Earth's atmosphere. As the summer of 1816 approached, the full effect of Tambora's eruption descended on the unsuspecting people of Europe.
There's descriptions of this sort of dusty fog hanging in day after day, cold and dreary rain. Just imagine kind of the worst blustery weather, except it's summer. That's what it was like in Northern Europe.
In 1816, Europeans were still recovering from the Napoleonic Wars and were once again reliant on agricultural resources spread too thinly. The Arctic weather devastated the continent's crops. Multitudes began to starve.
The people who survive are much, much weakened because of the lack of food. And disease becomes widespread. There's a huge outbreak of typhus that hits Ireland, and 100,000 people die of typhus that's directly related to the year without a summer.
History of a quieter kind was being written at one of Europe's most remote resorts.
The summer of 1816, Percy Bysshe Shelley, the Romantic poet, and his wife Mary Shelley, who was 19 years old, and their friend Lord Byron went to the shores of Lake Geneva to have their summer vacation. And normally they would go hiking and boating and having fun, but it was so cold and gloomy that summer that they couldn't go out and enjoy themselves. So they decided to have, they were writers, they decided to have a contest to see who could write the scariest ghost story to pass the time. And that summer, Mary Shelley wrote Frankenstein. If you look at Frankenstein, at the beginning of the book, the monster is climbing over the ice in the Arctic. And at the end of the book, the monster is also climbing over the ice. It's a very cold imagery. And she even writes at the beginning of the book how this imagery, this thinking about how cold and icy it was influenced by the climate outside the door when she was writing the book.
As Europe's bitter summer persisted, it continued to trigger famine and epidemics. The people could finally stand no more. In France, rioting mobs attacked grain carts on their way to market. In England, the starving carried banners reading "Bread or Blood" as they looted and vandalized town after town. In Switzerland, desperate villagers seized Russian grain shipments at the border. The governments of Europe were not equipped to provide the food and relief that people demanded. Tens of thousands starved to death. Just as many fled Europe, hoping to rebuild their lives in America. Across the Atlantic, however, the consequences of Tambora descended with equal ferocity in the United States. In June, 14 months after the eruption, the skies over New England turned icy cold. Temperatures plummeted below freezing, and 5 days of snow fell in the northeast.
And people were just shocked. Normally in June you never had snow, you had rainstorms but not snow, and so people were shocked and wrote in their diaries about what strange weather they were having.
Snow persisted sporadically throughout July and August. Ice formed on lakes in Vermont. Icicles a foot long clung to the eaves of houses, and hundreds of newly shorn sheep froze to death. Each wave of cold destroyed thousands of crops. 75% of America's corn was ruined. Across the Northeast, food shortages mounted and agricultural prices skyrocketed.
Birds are falling dead out of the sky because it is that cold. This is devastating for farmers, something they cannot recover from, and something that is completely unheard of. At that point, people began referring to this as 1800 and froze to death, or else the year without a summer.
In America, it helped push the nation west.
Things were so bad in New England in the summer of 1816 that there was this spike in the number of people who just gave up. That was it. No more New England, and they moved west. And they have no idea that the cause of this is a volcano that goes off the year before, halfway around the world.
Around 1850, 4 decades after the year without a summer, the Little Ice Age came to an abrupt end. The dramatic shift occurred over the course of perhaps only a decade.
The end of the Little Ice Age was caused by fewer volcanic eruptions during that period.
Will another ice age strike? When? And what devastating effects might it have on humanity? A recent report commissioned by the Pentagon may be an alarming blueprint of the future. "150 years have passed since the end of the Little Ice Age. Climate and humanity alike have been transformed. A cool, agrarian world of 1 billion is now a warming, mechanized planet teeming with over 6 billion. An ice age. They theorize that the same process that may have caused the Little Ice Age is repeating itself.
Some of my colleagues think that we could go into an abrupt cooling state in a matter of decades.
What consequences would an abrupt cooling have on 21st century civilization?
If we look at all of that's happened in the last 2 centuries, all of the development both in this country and globally, it's all been within the context of people being used to what their natural climate is like. In other words, they have a certain range of expectations for summers and winters and what the average climate is. The process of being thrown in one extreme or another that's different from what you're used to, it's that change in adaptation that causes cultural chaos.
If anything that the Little Ice Age will teach us is that dramatic changes in weather patterns will have incredible negative impacts on human populations. We could have conditions that will parallel the horrors that Europe faced in the Little Ice Age.
If an ice age struck in the 21st century, would our technologically dependent society, burdened by thinly spread resources, be just as vulnerable as the world of our ancestors? In 2003, the Pentagon commissioned futurists Peter Schwartz and Doug Randall to forecast the possible consequences. Their report is not a prediction, but a worst-case scenario designed to help government leaders formulate strategies to cope with any future crisis.
But it's a real probability.
The Pentagon scenario for the future is based on an actual climate event from the past. 8,200 years ago, temperatures dropped 9 degrees Fahrenheit for about a century. The abrupt cooling was minor compared to the last major ice age 15,000 years ago, but more severe than the Little Ice Age. The Pentagon scenario begins by plunging the Earth into the same frosty environment. Within a decade, nations are rapidly drained of food, water, and energy resources critical to national survival. In Europe, skirmishes erupt between neighboring states over access to shared rivers and oil reserves. The chill spawns a new world disorder. As the cold, dry climate persists, famine intensifies in the nations neighboring its southern border. The starving and the displaced begin a massive migration towards the United States.
One can imagine literally many tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, perhaps even millions of refugees coming on our shores from particularly the Caribbean and Central America. But there's another weirder scenario, where people in the Southwest find it better to head south, where the conditions in the southwestern United States are so bad, and maybe they need to go into Mexico, into Central America. Hard to predict. So the question of the transparency and polarity of our border will be an important question.
One of the most volatile flashpoints in the Pentagon scenario is China. Here, the cold climate triggers famines that kill millions, and also drains the nation's energy supplies. A civil war erupts in the most populous nation on Earth. At the same time, China's army threatens to invade Russia to seize its rich reserves of natural gas. And its navy confronts the United States in the Persian Gulf over access to Saudi Arabian oil.
Many of the same effects that I'm describing for China will also be true for India. And now you take into account Pakistan, where it could also be very true, and suddenly you have a devil's brew of 3 nuclear-armed countries, all potentially struggling over shared water supplies, access to water, food, and so on, and you have all of the makings for serious conflict. It's not at all implausible that these are the conditions under which nuclear weapons might be used.
Could a 21st century ice age actually ignite this apocalyptic chain of events? Critics of the Pentagon's report brand it alarmist fantasy. Others contend it raises issues too profound to ignore.
If we're not prepared for this scenario, it increases the likelihood of conflict. That's what I'm most worried about. I think a great deal more research needs to be done. We need to really understand the dynamics of abrupt climate change. We need much better data, much better models, much more support for the research, and then a really aggressive debate within the scientific and policy communities about how urgent the priority of this is.
Researchers are in a race to find the elusive answers before our volatile climate reaches a critical threshold. As they look to the future, the only certainty is that nothing is certain. Not so long ago, the Little Ice Age pushed civilization over a threshold with devastating consequences. If the past is a prologue, a storm awaits on the horizon.